If you ask a film buff what was the worst decade for film, most likely they're going to say the 1950s. And although it may seem like this at first when you're just getting into film, I completely beg to differ. Now, to start, the 1950s were a very weird decade for cinema. A few years before, the Second World War had ended, and after the 1950s, Hollywood's second golden era, also known as the reinvention of Hollywood, took place. This makes film of the 1950s standing at a weird crossroads between an evil time and a golden time. Now, I know that in the 1950s, the first golden era was still going on, but it was pretty much over in the mid-50s, so half of the decade's film was obscure. But in my opinion, seeing cinema like this is very interesting, as it showed how film was on the verge of becoming more serious, yet was still kind of flawed, as most films before Hollywood's second golden era were primarily strictly for entertainment, even if that meant that they had to be silly, and not always in a good way. Another reason why people hate on 1950s cinema is the lack of diversity of genres that decade had to offer. Westerns, sci-fi horror, and thrillers were basically all you got back then. Of course, there were a few outliers, but the majority were the few I just mentioned, so people got, and still are, just bored. But I think that even though there was a lack of diversity, the films are still good, and with the thriller genre, the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, was in his prime. Vertigo, Rear Window, North by Northwest, and many more came from Hitchcock in that decade, and for that, it makes that decade automatically iconic. Whenever I think about 1950s cinema, I get this weird nostalgia feeling even though I wasn't alive in that decade to experience it firsthand. But watching these movies now just makes me feel like I'm in the 1950s as I watch them for the first time. And for the multiple reasons that I just pointed out, in my opinion, the 1950s were a good decade for film, actually.